with that, I'm just going to quickly sit down after introducing Megan Stifel. Megan is the moderator for this afternoon's events, so she'll be the master of ceremonies the rest of the way. Megan, I again suspect, is known to most of you. Started off, at least as far as I know, at the Department of Justice, went on to the National Security Council at the White House, moved on to do other things. She was at GCA for a while, running one of our programs, and is these days the Chief Strategy Officer for the Institute for Security and Technology, a cyber-involved, but not exclusively cyber or think tank, do tank organization headed out of California. And Megan's another one of the knights in shining armor in this space. So Megan, over to you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes, I think so. Thank you, Phil, for the kind introduction. Thanks, everyone. We're entering that phase of the afternoon where you're getting tired, you've had your lunch. So we're here to spice things up, I hope, and we invite all of you to help us in doing so. I'm going to very quickly, because as you've heard, and I just want to take a moment to say thanks to Phil and the GCA team for putting together what has already been, I think, a very informative day of discussions, and that will carry on for the next 24 hours. So before I forget to say thank you, thanks and well done. With all deliberate speed, I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists, and then we're going to swing into some questions. We do expect to have some time for all of you at the end of this conversation to also ask questions. And then, of course, we'll have some breakouts, and we'll give you those instructions at the end. So the goal for this session is to summarize some of the key ideas we just heard and identify potential solutions to be discussed in the following breakouts. Phil, if you heard him at the beginning of the day, said there can't be more than 4. Well, now we're thinking maybe it's like a multi-headed hydra that has 4 parts. So we'll get into some of that, I think, this afternoon. Hydra, a good Hydra, not an evil Hydra, right? Like, I don't know, is that Circe from, anyways, Game of Thrones? Something. So first, Bryan Nunez from OTF is here. I'm down at the other end is Rob Knake, who's now at ActZero, but was one of the principal authors of the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy. Immediately to Rob's right, we have Florian Schütz from the OECD Working Party on Security in the Digital Economy and the Swiss Cyber Security Delegate. And in the middle, we have Bonnie Leff from Mastercard. And certainly last but not least, Dianna Langley, who has been joining us from NetHope in some of these conversations over the past, I don't know, 2 years or so at least, even longer than that. So we've heard about a number of solutions, and as Phil also noted, of course, all of you read the read ahead that talked about 4 or 5 different ways we might consider this: a global fund, an accelerator model. Interesting to hear some of the conversation this morning from some of the funders about the value that those types of opportunities can bring. I think one thing that's worth noting is that we are in a bit of a, as I said, combining of these key tools that we might leverage. We've heard from the first panel about the nature that the attack framework needs to be nimble and needs to be constantly updated, that its funding needs to be sustained over years because, as we all know, this is a field that is not at all static. And so we'll need to think about models to support those types of activities. At the same time, though, we need agility, and so we need to be able to stand up quickly resources to support a situation. Many of us are familiar with both Heartbleed and the Log4j incident. And so thinking about how we can best support the open source software community may need some greater agility than we might need for some of these longer term issues. So we need both the ability to have a fund that, like Gavi, that supports the need for ongoing ability to update vaccines across the world, but we need the startup solution. What this also points out to us is that there is no one single solution. So we need to bring together this solution of solutions, I think. And so we're going to get into that this afternoon. So without further ado, Bryan, I'm going to turn to you first. We've talked about a fund that that's funded by many and could be used to support cybersecurity for the common good. Your fund that is intended to counter online censorship and combat repressive surveillance. So having heard a little bit of the discussion today, how do you see that potentially applying in our field?
Thanks, Megan, and thanks everyone for having us here. Yeah, it was a very interesting, and inspirational discussion so far. Just a little bit about OTF. We are an independent 401c3 funder that gets the majority of our money through a line item in the National Defense Authorization Act. We have about $40 million, which Megan alluded to combat censorship and surveillance. The reason I'm here, I think, was because of an event that Govind, I don't know if he was here earlier.
He was, yes.
Yes, to talk about funding open source software. And I think where we sit in the space is sort of at the sort of beginning stages of the development of the type of technologies that can combat censorship and surveillance. And so 10 years on after the funding of OTF, we find ourselves in a position where part of that duty of care includes being able to sustain the softwares that we initially funded as prototypes. And I think the through line connects to what we've been discussing here, which is how do we create some sort of sustainable funding model for not just the things that we're funding, but the entire ecosystem of cybersecurity. So the way we approached it last year was to begin work on a FOSS Sustainability Fund, which addresses some of those issues that go sort of beyond free and open source software, which is sort of the underpinning concept behind how we approach software development, meaning that it's free to use, the source code is open, so it can be audited and evaluated for security flaws, for example. And I lost my train of thought. Okay, so yes, being able to support that type of software on a long-term sustainable basis is just part of the ecosystem that we've been discussing here. And I think the way it ended up playing out was that Govind and Omidyar, Okta, GitHub, and the Schmidt Futures folks all pitched in to help us create the FOSS Sustainability Fund. And I think for those of you who work with government funding, U.S. government funding in particular, I think you end up running into a lot of restrictions on what you can fund. So the ability to have flexible funding from private sources and a diversity of funding sources gives you a lot more ability. Well, it gave us a lot more ability to fund some of the softer needs and the soft skills required to maintain open source software projects as almost more like organizations rather than development projects. So to see the way that the other panelists have discussed the context in which they've funded their work, I think is completely applicable in this case, because I think not only do you need a diversity of funding sources, but you need a diversity of funders. And the key to that is also, going back to my comment about Govind's event last year, was how do we create that narrative and how do we sell it in a way that that makes sense and that catalyzes interest and participation from both the private and public sector.
Thanks, Bryan. So, Rob, I'm coming to you, but the question, I think, so I heard both, there was initially government funding, a significant amount of government funding, another 10-year reference, and I Am the Cavalry also being 10 years this year. Then most recently, there was a combination of private sector-led funding. Rob, you and I have been talking off and on for a few years, and you also, Bryan, finished on this narrative question. So, Rob, you and I have been talking about B Corps, and you'll hear, I think, later today or tomorrow from one company that actually is a B Corp on the cybersecurity side of things. So help, for those of us in the audience here, for those in the audience who may not be familiar with B Corps and this idea of a certification process which might accompany nonprofits advocating, supported through this fund, advocating for more secure technologies, but also for support for nonprofits. How would the B Corp approach potentially support the common good cyber concept?
Sure, yeah. Is this actually on? Okay. So I really actually think I am here flagging an idea that Megan has really developed, which is the idea of cyber B Corp. So just to begin with, B Corps is the idea that there are companies who are saying we are committed to a double bottom line. There are things that we care about beyond simply our profitability. We care about the sustainability of the planet. We care about our communities. We want to make sure we're providing a living wage to all our employees. And so they make this pledge and they are certified as B Corps, and then they hope that their customers recognize that they have done that and then are willing to pay more for their service than a company that doesn't make those pledges. So that's the basic idea behind a B Corp. The idea behind a cyber B Corp is to look at the cybersecurity community, the resellers, the product providers, the companies that make money in cybersecurity, and get them to pledge funding for the kind of things that we want to see funded at this workshop today, the kind of things that will ultimately reduce the risk to everybody. So there's sort of two problems that I want to address simultaneously here. The first is kind of a moral hazard problem in cybersecurity, in which companies that sell cyber products don't necessarily, in fact, they really don't want to see this problem go away. They don't want to discuss things like, should we ban ransomware payments? No, absolutely not. Oh, it would be terrible. Why? This is a panel that Megan and I did just last week on this subject, which is why she's smiling. Because if you do that, and if that actually worked, then you wouldn't have the reason to sell your product. And so I want to combat that by saying, okay, if I am a cybersecurity company and I'm selling a product, I want my incentives to be not just to protect my customer, but to protect the whole ecosystem. I want to do things like fund Quad 9 so that there are fewer hot points that adversaries can use as part of a botnet to attack my customers. I want the whole ecosystem to be more secure. So that would be the idea behind the Cyber B Corps.
Thank you. I think it was another joint fund or a joint initiative between the two of us, perhaps. But in any event, thanks, Rob, for outlining that and for bringing some spice. I hope you all are now a little bit more awake than you were a few minutes ago. Dianna, we've also been discussing this idea where nonprofits do joint fundraising, and the giving to these groups, members of the group, is federated and divided up between the participants. NetHope is an organization of some of the largest nonprofits. Can you share some thoughts on this idea and how it's worked and what remains a challenge, especially in this space?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed bag. So I work for an organization called NetHope, and we've actually been doing this for about 22 years because those 65 INGOs, international nonprofits, so those are the ones that World Vision, Oxfam, CARE, Concern, those folks. 22 years ago, their major problem was, can we get internet? And now it is, can we do this well? And it's cybersecurity. And fundamentally at that time, they were facing much of what we're facing here, which is, this is not fundable for us. Our main value point for Save the Children is not how good am I at cybersecurity. That's not what they go to market with. And so their funders just don't fund that in the background. And so if I talk about it now, NetHope is 65 of those organizations. And for us, that means about 30 of them are HQ'd here in the US. More than 2/3 of them have got domestic programs here. They look after some 1.67 billion people around the world as infrastructure of last resort. And yet, there are maybe 6 CISOs. Maybe. It's rough. And so parts of what we've been doing over those 22 years and lessons that I can bring, which I think is what Megan was not wanting me to do here. And I've heard this a lot, but maybe to clarify a little bit, longevity of funding. In our group, it was the ringing endorsement of, if it's project funding, it is not going to work. The only reason we're here for 22 years is because the same funders that started with us around that kitchen table, Microsoft, Cisco, they've worked with us all the time, and their grants are mostly semi-unrestricted and are working in a space that's easier for us. That allows us to do sub-funding and sub-granting to members when they need it. It allows us to have an emergency response fund so that when internet goes down, directly after a Nepal earthquake, someone can run and put it back up together again. Because again, surprisingly, there is no standing capacity to do that, so someone has to do that. Another part that just to bring in is the complexity of the situation means that you need that type of funding. It can't be project funding. It can't be, I need to train 20 people, because that's not going to change the source of where we got to a problem. So it has to be things that it's funding you to do advocacy. It's funding you to come to a conference to talk to this. It's funding you to work and change internal structures. It's those kinds of things which are much, much harder to find. They don't come up in traditional USAID grants or traditional government funding. And then the last I would say, which is the part to bring in here, is it is about community, because you really can train people and you can get them to all do their cybersecurity certifications, but it's the community of practice that actually makes that real. It helps people to do actual risk assessment. It helps them to do their jobs well. And infrastructure that holds a community together, the conferences, the online platforms, the memberships, that needs funding too. Otherwise, it's all just point solutions. And so for NetHope, where we found success there is where our partners understand holding that together. And that's why we host the Global Humanitarian ISAC, because that's what that's about. It's the collective being together, doing it better, where it's not just the book learning, it's actually the in-practice part together.
Thanks, Dianna. I particularly appreciate the community comment as we turn over to Bonnie. Mastercard has been involved in both supporting communities. I know I was involved when I was at GCA in the Birmingham small business effort, but also in supporting cyber nonprofits. So as a funder in this space, I'm curious to hear how you all talk about this internally and how you're able to make that internal argument that making these investments in various nonprofits supports the bottom line. And then relatedly, kind of once you've made the case, or maybe it's the inverse, how do we make it easy for you to make the case internally that the efforts that we're pursuing are contributing to your world as well?
So a couple of things. I think that MasterCard's a very values-driven company. So we see ourselves as really connecting to the digital economy and building that economy. And as such, it's really easy for us to really make that connection internally and say that this is something that we need to do and really connect. And what we try to do, though, is make our investments through our Center for Inclusive Growth in 3 primary areas: in financial security, in small business, and in data impact science. And we do this in places where we have a very strong foothold in the company, in our expertise, and in our businesses. So that way, we're not just giving financial funding and resources, but we're also lending our expertise. So that's something that we try to do with our grantees, and it also then just makes a lot more sense as we're doing this. Another thing is that we're really in the business of trust. That is what we do. That is our whole brand. It's what we do. And as we've made a commitment and a public commitment that we are going to bring 1 billion more people into the digital economy and 50 more micro and small businesses into the digital economy, and as we build the digital transformation to do this, and as we bring more people into this economy, we can't do this alone. We know that we can't do this alone. We have to do this with governments. We have to do this with NGOs, and we know that this is a shared responsibility, and it can't be the responsibility of the underserved who we bring into this economy. So we have to do this with others, and again, these people that we bring in, it's not their responsibility to bear the brunt of the security for this digital economy that we bring them into. So this is something that is just so core to our mission. It's so core to the trust that we have to have to power this digital economy. So it's something that we yes, we're selling it in, but it's not really viewed in that way because it's so much a core to who we are and it's so connected to what we do. It's not like on the edge of who we are and what we do and what we practice every day. And like I know a lot of the people in the room because even though like me personally, I'm a practitioner, this is, I'm not in the foundation group. I work with the grantees because we're bringing to bear the resources of Mastercard day to day in our daily work. So that's how we view it.
Thanks, Bonnie. And I think we're hearing again between Microsoft, Google, and Mastercard this idea that there are two arms to that are being leveraged together, and hopefully we can further articulate how we might expand that and scale that with other organizations as we work through the next kind of phase of this initiative. But of course, data has to drive all of this, basically, or should drive all of this. So Florian, you're going to help us solve this data problem, right? You've been the chair of the OECD Working Party on Security in the Digital Economy. How can we help you help us help you help us?
Yeah, so I think we also need to take a little step back and look at the problem, right? So we talk a lot about cyber. What is cyber? I heard the phrase, we solve cyber. That's the same as saying we solve geopolitics. That's not a valid phrase. Cyber is many different topics. And so there's not just data. We need to be very specific about what data do we actually need to have impact. And we discussed about the business model. How can we get a business model that allows not-for-profits to be successful in their mission? We didn't talk a lot about the mission, did we? Do we want to secure routing? Do we want to secure DNS? Do we want to have research about future infrastructure that are more resilient, that are better built? A lot of infrastructure we use is 50 years old. We made progress, yet we don't roll out new protocols on a global level. What is the space for not-for-profits and NGOs there? And so I think it's very important to start with why do we want to do what we want to do? So we want a more resilient infrastructure. I think that's what we can agree on. But we also want to balance risk. We don't want a completely secure internet. That's not in the interest of anyone. If you don't have any freedom, if you just regulate it down, bolt it down, and have the funding for your usual suspects that make sure those rules aren't broken. And I think there it is very important on the one hand side to define what risks are we actually willing to take, or where do we have a shared risk appetite. And then that allows us to get with some data that is gathered. What are we actually talking about? Let me give you an example. Ransomware, we talked about it. The problem would be so much smaller if systems would just be patched, period. Almost no attacks use zero-day exploits. So if you have the data about that, and I know I don't have the exact data, I'm trying to bring at least our government to actually gather that data, and we're working in OECD to actually gather that on a bigger scale, then we could say, okay, where should we actually invest, and where can a not-for-profit help us? Is it actually seeing the things on the wire, in the internet exchange points, at the ISP level, in the tier 1 networks, wherever? And then actually you can start to formulate a business model around it, and you can start to understand, is there a product that is self-financing? And I do think in one way it needs to be. If you need to run infrastructure, if you need to scale infrastructure globally, this is not going to work donation-based in my humble opinion. I would be very happy to be proven wrong, but you need a business model behind that. And then last but not least, what is very, very important is you need to be able to articulate the benefit you generate. And that's one thing I see a lot with policymakers, especially in Europe. What's in it for them? Why should they fund it, right? So Quad 9 was mentioned. There was a legal case against Quad 9 redirecting towards a site that contained pirated material, right? This is the same as suing the person putting up the Washington sign, giving directions towards Washington, saying, hey, there's crime there, let's sue the person that put up that sign. But there was no outcry. It wasn't understood. The communities discussed it a little bit, but it wasn't a big issue on a policy level. It wasn't clear that that could pave a way towards actually corporates taking regulation in their hand away from governments, right? And saying that's the content you're allowed to see, that's the content you're not allowed to see. And I think a lot of not-for-profits struggle with explaining what would happen if they weren't there, what would happen if their service isn't there, the negative model. And I do think another part of the solution is actually to draw the big scheme of things, and that's what we're trying also to see in our discussions at the OECD. How do these little puzzle pieces connect? That's not one organization can do on their own. They can say that's our value and then balance that out and try to reach agreement across governments how to balance it out, and also put out meaningful regulation in the sense of recommendations.
So I think you mentioned something that we've sort of had this theme today of this idea of can't not do, or what if something went away? What if Shadow Server went away? I see Stu sitting over there, so I'll pick on him. So how do we, and part of the way that we prevent that from happening, right, is to build a better narrative. So I think as we're thinking about picking the 4 or building the Hydra, I want to make sure that we've considered all the options, or at least most of the options. And so are there other ideas that you all have contemplated but haven't yet had a chance or haven't heard come to the conversation before we then turn to the audience for questions if they have some? So what have we left off by any chance? We've talked about accelerators, joint funds, federated giving, data-driven.
So yeah, if I may, I think one thing that we underestimate is making leadership figures or organization heroes in that space, right? We often talk about Microsoft and Google, and they earned their place in giving them as examples. We don't use, we are the cavalry, at least not in Europe, quite often as a role model and stress that enough. And so I do think another part of the solution is actually to show and mention the great minds that make all of that possible, and really also promote their status. Because in the end, you need to build a living on something, right? And one of the incentives of going there and doing the things that you do is actually also to have impact and to be able to show that kind of impact. And I think that's one element in the discussion that is quite often underappreciated.
How do you think we would do that, should do that?
So I think one thing is, and we're really trying that at the OECD. So for example, organizing events where we invite those people from the community and give them a stage to present themselves, to present their ideas. We will also have events where it's more about the dialogue. So for example, there will be the Global Forum on Security and Digital Economy for Prosperity in South Korea, where also people will be able to promote their ideas. And what is very, very important, right? We're talking about the global phenomenon. And trust me, even today in some discussions, for me as a European, they were a bit special in that I couldn't really relate to the problems on the table. And when we go to Asia, that changed again. And I think actually pulling that on an international level and giving an international stage to these people, to these organizations that quite often operate on a global scale and make them part of the dialogue, gives them the exposure they deserve.
Rob, you look like you were going to say something, but I don't know if you were.
I wouldn't be me if I didn't put out regulation as a solution that we really should be looking to. A lot of the things nonprofits do are really filling a gap on things that government should simply require, right? So when we look at things like providing secure DNS, that's probably something that the FCC should just be requiring every ISP to provide, or that every federal grant for cyber connectivity should be requiring a recipient to provide for their users. And then I think if you have that kind of requirement, if you're changing that market dynamic, there may be places where it makes sense for nonprofits to fill in rather than for-profit companies. But that, I think, is a vital missing component of the conversation.
More spice from Rob. Dianna?
So super weirdly, but I actually have an observation about this because in the world of humanitarian response, like in an aid response after an earthquake, it's not a free-for-all. Because you cannot afford to have a market failure at that point in time. So the massive aid agencies that you see get on planes and go and rescue people, they have specialisms. They don't all do exactly the same thing, because you would end up with 20 tents and no food and water. And that's where things like the UN has, partly for things that people won't ever know here, but have got coordination mechanisms, have got, you are the agency that is recognized as the first responder in that. Would there be other agencies that come in? Yes. But there is a recognition that you are the premier, you are the first, because that is your specialism, to put in water and sanitation. And I'm wondering if that's partly what we're getting to here, which is we're in that very interesting space where we're trying to talk about having a market, and everybody's out and we're all doing little businesses and we're doing those kinds of things, and yet also working together as a community. And that's going to be very difficult for us to thread the needle. And I feel like we're jumping around it a little bit, trying to work out what we're going to do.
Yes, I think there's, many of us in this room who are at nonprofits have been the beneficiaries of the Hewlett Foundation's initiative that really kicked things off, and Craig has come to the table, as have a few others, Omidyar and the like. And they've done so in a thoughtful way. And now, in many cases, particularly with the exit of Hewlett, we're kind of being handed off. We've gotten to the teenage years, if you will, since we're no longer 10 years old. We're entering the teenage years, but we need to get to our. Do we need to get to our senior status? And I think that's an open question. I think to Rob's point, and the strategy sets this out, that eventually the goal is that the responsibility for secure technologies is born in a different place than it currently is. But it will take us some time to get there. And so there is an ongoing need for nonprofits like those in this room to help advocate for us to get more quickly to that place. But in the course of doing so, as you say, we need to leverage our own specialties. And so, this is maybe unfair question, Bonnie, since we're going off script a little bit, but I'm sure, or I imagine that in the course of your work with the organizations that you've worked with, you've had to sort of decide who to pick. Yeah. Which of your children is your favorite? Those types of questions. So how, are there tips that you would offer to us as we're thinking about how we better narrate our strategy, or our specialty?
I think one of the things that we also have looked for is that the organizations have multiple funding sources. I think that it's a concern when we're the only funding source or there's not a long-term plan, because I think, as it was talked about this morning, talking about sustainability and what is the long-term plan. So we actually look to help the grantees develop some of those plans, and in some cases, we help them do that, actually, to say, how will you operate long-term? How can we help you develop that funding strategy? So I think that is something that is important, and we do get concerned, if we are, the primary source and there aren't other sources. So that is something that is, I think, fairly important, because we, of course, like every company, have, a limited pool, and then that limits our ability to fund other people, because our pool isn't necessarily going to grow. So then that means that, we're also only locked in, right? That means we can't look at other sources as well. So that is something that I would say, too, is a consideration.
Sure. And Bryan, I think in the idea of building this FOSS fund last last fall, and this will be the last question before we go to the audience. You were able then, or collectively, there was a decision by those stakeholders who came together to form the fund that was the priority and agreement on kind of who to support through that fund. Can you talk a little bit about how that process came together?
Yeah, I mean, it was, they were very magnanimous about basically letting us drive the bus on the funding. But I think there was a recognition among all of the stakeholders who came together that the sustainability of free and open source software projects was a critical need. But I think, I can't emphasize enough the fact that it's just a drop in the bucket. It's part of a larger problem set that was mentioned earlier. I think we need to find our lanes and figure out, I think to your point about coordination, who's good at what, and being able to share information around both funding and expertise. As everyone was talking, I kept going back to, in a previous life, I was a funder with the Open Society Foundation, and one of my colleagues used to always say, she was from South Africa, and she would always say, the goat with a dozen goat herders ultimately starves. And I think it always comes back to this point where everyone wants to do something, but no one knows what to do, and if we all share the responsibility equally, then no one has accountability to we end up just watching this goat get skinnier and skinnier.
Sure, I think, that maybe this will be the point where I turn to all of you. I think we are now, I think Kelly was saying, we're no longer the emergent group. We've arrived. But now I think what we also recognize is that not so far off in the distance, there is a cliff. And it takes many shapes for many people, but the sense of urgency is one that I think has become even more acute since the Hewlett Foundation has sunsetted its initiative. And we, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, have had the benefit of a few funders coming together, but we need more. And so thinking about, really sort of the call to action of uniting together, working out on our specialties, this idea maybe of leveraging, rather than finding, I forget who mentioned it earlier today, the one terrific grant writer who supports one organization, leveraging those skills, whether they be in grant writing or, you heard Craig, he's often reminding me that we need to do a better job of communicating what it is that we do. So leveraging public relations, narrative building, thinking about how we can better build the case through data to support the work that we're doing. And maybe that data does ultimately support a certification model. Maybe not, we'll see. So we have a few minutes for questions, and then I must give you all directions remind you of where you're supposed to go, and it has to do with color coding. So any questions from the audience? You all want to get up and stretch your legs. We've solved the world's problems. I don't think so, Josh.
Well, I mentioned a B Corp. You might have to repeat this, but B Corp for maybe solving the moral hazard of a security vendor. But David Rice wrote economics. He thinks, if you were to take this analogy of cyber insecurity applied to pollution, then we have all this pollution cast off in these seas of trash, in the ocean, and the cybersecurity people are trying to figure out how to organize volunteers to clean up trash off the oceans, or to get tractors to comb the trash. The producers, the major producers of cyber pollution or insecurity aren't so much the security vendors, it's the IT that has not seen or been incentivized to have less pollution coming out of the IT that we procure. So is there also a B Corp model for those, or someone earlier called it a tax, but is there, if you're doing all the electronic medical record systems for hospitals, and that's the thing that goes down and kills people often, do you bear some proportional responsibility to matching regulation? So whether it's a B Corp thing or regulation, there's hazards for both the producers of IT and those who attempt to secure IT.
So, I mean, the short answer is that we've got the regulatory mechanisms to solve that problem. We don't have sufficient regulatory oversight or clear enough regulations or penalties to solve that problem, specifically at least to healthcare. Now, more broadly, I think, and this is where I'll go back to the idea of software liability, is something that you and I have been talking about for several years now as one of the solutions in this space, right? How do we place the costs back on the producers of insecure software so that the community is not having to bear that expense, and so we're not totally reliant on cybersecurity providers, right? So to steal a Phil Venable's line, right? If we know that the goal is we want secure IT products, not more security products, how do we get there? And I think software liability is probably the biggest part of that.
Florian.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I do think we also have a problem in the cybersecurity community. We often talk about the attacks and defenses, and honestly, that's the boring part of the game. The interesting part is to build secure software. Now, that's hard. That's actually impossible to solve because it's a Turing-complete problem. But I do think there are still mechanisms that we don't deploy enough. There are those that we can use, but also I do think we need to look more at how do actually companies operate? Do they have a process to fix their vulnerabilities within a given time? Do they actually listen to reports? There's also a discussion within OECD, how can we build these safe harbors? How can we incentivize to actually get your stuff tested? And then I think there's other mechanisms that are, at least I don't see in Europe yet, is like consumer protection magazines, right? You would never buy a teddy bear that has poisonous color at it, right? Somewhere there would be a magazine telling you, hey, this is bad for your kid, and it's not being continued sold in the market. For software, we actually there saying, hey, this is actually a very bad home router. It's full of errors. Buy it. It's cheap, right? And so I think we haven't yet used all the mechanisms, and as you point out, and I do think that's exactly where the model of the B Corp could actually come in, or maybe it needs a regulatory body or some other incentives.
Stu.
Sorry, I was just going to make, and I don't want to get, well, going up on you, Rob, you were saying about fulfilling a role that government should be regulating for and try and fix things. And I agree with you. I wish governments could regulate all of this away and the world would be great. But for those of us who are doing this, we're doing this for a mission because governments don't do that and they can't do that. And we're going to be 50, 100 years before we've regulated just for those problems. When you look at the world, whether it's in cyberspace, whether it's dealing with humanitarian aid, the people that are in this room, we're doing it because we're mission driven and we really want to make a difference and try and make the world a little bit better. How can we make governments go faster with regulation?
How can we make governments move faster than Russia? Because we're all mission-driven people, but
That's another conference.
No, maybe if I may, I'm sorry, I tried to keep it short. I don't think regulation solves the problem, to be honest. I think you need to use regulation where it helps, and regulation can, in my opinion, provide two functions. One, it can equalize the market among unequal players, or it can actually drive down risk appetite within a market. And that's a tool it is good for. But many of the problems are not solved with that, right? And that's why I do think, yes, we need to have the regulation discussion, but we also need to have the incentives discussion. And when we look at the history of the internet, and we talked about it in this early this morning, we didn't mention one group that is hugely responsible that the internet is what it is today. That's the hippies. Yes, it was the hippies who actually wanted to promote the world catalog to bring it to other hippies and that instrumentalized the internet to share information. Or why else do you think Berkeley is big in the game, right? So I think, and that sparked in a regulation-free or almost regulation-free environment. The 90s, the dot-com boom, and so on. So yes, we might need some regulation, but also be very careful. Sometimes we don't want security, but we want actually freedom and we want innovation.
I don't know, Rob, if you want the final word, otherwise we're all going to get the rope.
I'll give the 20-second answer. Sometimes the answer is not regulation. Sometimes the answer is direct government funding. So for something like botnet takedowns, ransomware group takedowns, I think what we've been lacking is the government coming in and saying, look, we're going to fund an organization to bring all you players together. And then something like the B Corp to shame the large players into participating in that. Right, so those two mechanisms together, I think in that case, would be much more effective than any kind of regulatory model I can come up with, at least on the fly.
Okay, so thanks to our panelists. I'm going to take a brief moment here